Hello! Welcome to Chapter 11 of the Candy Corn Contest by Patricia Riley Gift. Today was the last day of school before Thanksgiving. Richard took a long time walking to school. He kept thinking about the candy corn number. It was the last day for the contest. He was going to be in trouble when he didn't win. He said some numbers in his head. He tried to forget 278. He saw Matthew going into the schoolyard. He wished he could forget about Matthew, too. Matthew must feel terrible about the party. Richard knew he'd feel terrible, too. 290, he said in a loud voice. 280, 315, 876. He kicked out a pile of brown leaves. 278, he said in a little voice. A real pilgrim would tell Miss Rooney about the candy corn, Richard thought. A real pilgrim would say he had eaten 3 pieces. The bell rang in the schoolyard. Miss Rooney's line started for the doors. 492! Richard yelled. He ran to catch up. Matthew saw him coming. Hurry! He yelled. The monitor told Richard to stop running. He had to get in line with the 3rd graders. Matthew turned around. Good news, he called. The monitor yelled at everyone to be quiet. Richard wondered what Matthew's news was. Matthew looked happy. Matthew was his friend. Matthew should be coming to a sleepover. 326, Richard whispered. He couldn't be happy. He wouldn't be happy if his friend didn't want him at a sleepover. He wouldn't be smiling. In the classroom, everyone was running around. Miss Rooney was late today. Matthew met him at the door. Guess what? He said. I just saved your life. Richard looked at Matthew's face. He looked at Matthew's stick-out ears. It would be terrible if Matthew didn't come to a sleepover party. Matthew, he said, I want you to come. Matthew held out his hand. Look, he said. Please come to my sleepover, Richard said. He looked down. Matthew had 3 fat pieces of candy corn in his hand. Richard looked at the candy corn. He wondered if it had the wet the bed smell. But today, Matthew smelled different. Not a lot different, just a little different. Put them in that jar. Put them in the jar, Matthew said. Richard opened his eyes wide. You just saved my life, Matthew, he said. Miss Rooney came rushing in the door. Woo, she said. I had a flat tire. I'm sorry I'm late. Richard followed her to the desk. She looked up. Yes, Richard. I ate 3 pieces of candy corn. Matthew gave me 3 more. He didn't want me to get in trouble. I thought I'd better tell you, though. Miss Rooney opened her mouth into a fat O. Matthew opened the top of the jar. He dropped in the candy corn. A pilgrim wouldn't have eaten 3 pieces of candy corn, Miss Rooney said. Then she smiled. But you're a true pilgrim for telling me. Then Miss Rooney clapped her hands. Please stop running around, she told the class. Everyone went to his seat. Richard put his books away. I forgot to say thank you, he whispered to Matthew. It's all right, Matthew said. You've got to come to my sleepover, Richard said. Matthew looked out the window. I guess I could come, he said. Right, said Richard. He thought about Mrs. Parris. He remembered what she had said. When someone has a problem, help if you can. Maybe, he told Matthew, you could take a bath. For a party, I would, Matthew said. In fact, I've been trying to take a bath more than usual. That's good, Richard said. Yeah, Matthew said. I never liked baths much, but Mrs. Parris gave me some bubble bath. Lucky, Richard said. Matthew nodded. She gave it to me when I erased the board for her. He took out his library book. I'm up to the last sentence on page 1. Richard listened as Matthew read. Most, Matthew sounded out, most of the time crocodiles live in rainforests. Matthew slammed the book shut. 1 page, he said to Richard. 1 guess. Good, Richard said. That reminds me, Matthew said. I'm bringing an alarm clock to your sleepover. Really? Richard said. I'll get up a couple of times, Matthew said, to go to the bathroom. Oh, Richard said, that's a great idea. It was my mother's idea, Matthew said. All right, class, said Miss Rooney. Who has guesses? Timothy raised his hand. I have 5. I have 3, yelled Emily. Me too, said Jill Simon. 114, said Richard under his breath. 412. He raised his hand. I have a guess. Me too, Matthew said. I have a guess, a big one. 278, Richard said in his head. Everyone went up to Miss Rooney's desk. Jill guessed first. Timothy took 2 guesses. Then he stopped. I'm going to think for a few minutes, he said. Then it was Richard's guess. He wondered what a pilgrim would do. I think he began. He looked at Miss Rooney. 200, and he said slowly, 270. Miss Rooney leaned forward a little. She was smiling. No, said Richard, 342. Miss Rooney sat back. She shook her head. Timothy? I think it's in the 200s, he said. How about 241? Miss Rooney shook her head. 290? How about Matthew? Miss Rooney asked. Matthew squeezed his eyes together. 299, he said. Then he opened his eyes. My turn, Emily Arrow said. She took a deep breath. She looked at the jar. I think, she said, and stopped. I think it's 278. That's it, Miss Rooney yelled. Emily jumped up and down in her red sneakers. I don't believe it, she yelled. I don't believe it either, Timothy said. Now we'll count them, Miss Rooney said. Richard smiled at Matthew. Can we divide them up, Emily asked, so everyone can share? You're a true pilgrim, Miss Rooney said. She started to count. When they were finished counting, Miss Rooney did a big dividing example on the blackboard. Everyone gets 22 pieces, she said. Emily put 20 pieces on everyone's desk. There were 18 pieces left. Emily gave 10 to Miss Rooney. Mrs. Parris gets the rest, she said. Richard put 2 candy corn pieces in his mouth. He crunched down on them. He closed his eyes to taste the sugar better. Delicious. He opened his eyes and gave Matthew a little tap. Happy Thanksgiving, he said. And that is the end of the book. Thanks for listening. Bye.